Hi, folks. Coach Chris here. I am going to talk about something that I don't know, I find interesting. This is the time qualifying standards. If you have been in the sport of marathoning for some amount of time, you will have noticed that everybody seems to be getting a lot faster. And so some of these things you might want to look at and think about long term. If you plan to be running for a while, you're going to be running within different age groups, and there's different standards. And although these are probably not going to remain the same for another decade, the way things are going, it's still good to know and have some targets to plan out what's, 5 years down the road or 4 years down the road, where you're going to be entering a new age group. So let's look at these. I have here first, this is going to be sort of our basis of comparison. So what I've gathered is the men's marathon times, A for New York City Marathon 2024, based on those results, and then also all US marathon results for races over 200 people in that individual field size. And I've then charted them out here by age group and said, okay, this is the top 10, top 1%, top 10%, and also top 25%. So I'm not going to read these out, but you can look at this for yourself. I did do a little bit of math here, just comparing what's the top 10% from New York City Marathon versus the top 10% across the United States average for 2024. And one thing you will note here is that these are not that drastically different, which I think in and of itself is fascinating. I've highlighted here all of the age groups where the difference between the New York City Marathon average top 10% and the United States average is a minute or less. And so you can see there are several age groups there where that's true. There is only one age group where the average was slower than New York City Marathon. This is really fascinating. Reason being, if you're not familiar with New York City Marathon course, it is not a fast race. It has 810 feet of climbing. It is it is tricky. It is not a fast and flat by any stretch of the imagination, right? And so there is a course penalty built into that race versus a very flat, fast marathon. So this stat is pretty fascinating. That's the 25 to 29 age group there. Now we're going to look at the women's. Again, this is comparison that collected between the same data, just this is the women versus the men. Those same age pools, top 1%, top 10%, for New York City Marathon versus all US marathons. And then also I just put the top 25% in there just for reference. One thing I will say, people might be wondering in their head, why are you looking at New York City Marathon versus something else? Well, the answer to that is one, I live in New York. I've lived here for decades. I'm not going to say how long, very long time. And so this is my hometown race. I coach a huge number of people for this race. This is my local race. And so it's sort of near and dear to my heart. But second to that is New York City Marathon is the largest marathon in the entire world. That was true in 2024. So it has a large sample size, right? But it has also been true in other years. So it is sort of, it's a good barometer for what does the world of marathoning look like. It's an international race. And so that is the reason for that. All right, something different here on the women's side versus the men versus comparing the 10% averages top 10% New York versus top 10% for all US races. And you can see this is very striking here. So there are only two age categories where the women's times are a minute or less, and that's the 50, all of the 50s, 50 all the way up to 59. So what does that say? Very strong masters field. And then there are two age categories where the average for the US is slower than New York City Marathon. Again, New York City Marathon, hard course, slower course penalty, and yet it is fast. It has top 10% faster in these two 60-year-old age groups. So again, very strong competitive masters fields in New York. And then just to point out the obvious, the green, all of those faster times for the younger age groups for women. All right, now I have gathered together what are called high performance standards or sub-elite standards, also sometimes called ADP. London calls it championship, right? There are different names for this, but there's different types of standards. There's different types of time qualifying. Sometimes people get it all confused, or sometimes people think that all time qualifying is like Boston time qualifying. That is not the case. I have qualified as a sub-elite runner, high performance ADP championship, whatever you want to call it. Not in the men's standards because I'm a woman, but I have a good idea of what it is. And as you can see here, the breakdown, right? These are not every 5-year age group gets their own thing, and this is not what this is about. This is about selecting the cream of the crop of the cream of the crop. And to put it in terms of like runner terms and runner times, these times for the US races that are not majors, but US races with a larger field, say 1,000, a couple thousand people, these times would be the podium finishers, and really overall podium finishers. And then for the masters, if the race has masters categories, they would be the masters winners. So these are those time standards. They are for a regular type race, not major. These are basically elite times. In terms of the majors, where they have an elite field that is paid runners, that is runners that are their job, their life's work and profession is running, and that is what they are employed as. They are obviously true elites. They are elite elites, right? But these are the notch just below that. These are your worker runners, but that are really above standard amateur caliber, right? So the reason I point this out is when the Sydney time qualifying times were released, Sydney was just added to the majors. Oh man, people were like, "Oh, I can't believe this. This is insane." Blah, blah, blah. And it's not, because Sydney, these time qualifying standards for Sydney are high performance. This is not a Boston qualifying standard. Different process, different way of thinking about it. So I've explained all that. One thing I like to point out, if you're in this younger age group, if this is you and you are also already Boston qualifying, this is your next goal to aim for. This is the next thing you can put on your list, something to attack and go after. Reason being, these things are not going to get easier. I promise you. As a masters runner, I promise you this is not going to get easier. So put this in your sights. Put this on your bucket list as a stretch goal or something that you can work towards and attain, right? There are some of these races that do have a masters category and the masters standards, and that changes at 40 for several of these races. I was one of these people that has crossed over from open category to masters category. And let me tell you, I charted all of this out. I said, okay, I'm going to be 40. This is the time to go after these things. So these are the races where there is a demarcation between 39 and 40. Again, put this on your radar. Then there's Berlin that does something just a little bit different, but they have separate time for men 45 and older, and then they have another break at 60. So 50-year-old runners, 55-year-old runners, this is something, again, put on your list, on your stretch, goal, something to work towards, to look forward to ahead. This is something that you can go after. Here's the women's. This is the same, all of the same comparison between high performance and sub elite, and the same races just in the women's. And same principles apply here, right? Younger age groups, going after those younger, faster times, again, because when you turn 35, it doesn't get any easier. And then again at 40, there's the break there. The categories, I'll just say the races: Chicago, Sydney, and Houston. Houston is not a major, but it is a race that does attract elite caliber racers, and it's a very large race in the US. So I included it just again as comparison. And again, you can see where all of these numbers fit. So while people were freaking out about the Sydney times, these Sydney times, it's in keeping with these other races. It's nothing out of the ordinary at all. And then again, for Berlin, for the women as well as the men, the same break. There's a break at 45. You get an extra 20 minutes. And then again at 60, you get a good 50 minutes, which, if this is, depending upon your age, this is something you can work towards. Oh, one thing I did want to point out here. I also have listed here the Abbott World Age Group Championship times. And for those who, they did not make any announcement about this, but for the women, some of these times changed, and they just changed this year. Again, I'm in a master's category. I look at these times. I aim for these times because it gives me a goal and something to work towards. And so several of these times did change for the women, and they tightened in most cases. But here are the updated times for 2025, which will apply to the 2026 race. All right. Now I'm just going to look at things by age group. And the reason for this is, one, just to show what the difference is between the men's and the women's side, because things do progress in a different way. And then the other thing, I'm going to look pretty closely at the New York City Marathon time standards versus the average, because again, as I mentioned before, I have particular interest in New York City Marathon. And then it's because New York City Marathon changed their time qualifying process, whereby they're only taking the fastest times. And so this is something that has been of interest for people who want to run New York City Marathon. How much of a buffer do I need? All of these kinds of things. So I do not have a seeing eye, eye to tell you, predict the future, but I can tell you what we have, what data we have. All right. So the way these standards work for Boston, Chicago, and New York, it is pretty uniform. There are some age groups where this changes, but pretty uniform, which is Boston and Chicago are matched completely, and then New York is faster. Again, not true across the board for all age groups, but in the majority of age groups, this is the way it's organized. So here are the times. I'm not going to read them out. We're just going to scroll. But to note, New York City Marathon time on the women's side is 12 minutes faster than Boston, Chicago. And on the men's side, it's a 2-minute difference. This is the closest that the men's standard is between Boston, Chicago, and New York, 2 minutes. This is as close as it ever is across any age group, period. So if you are in this age category, 20 all the way up to 34, put this in the back of your mind. If you're already Boston qualifying, 2 minute difference to get to New York, possibly, or at least have the opportunity to submit an application for New York. 2 minutes. That's as close as it ever gets. All right. Now we're going to compare this to the averages and the top 10%, as I mentioned. So this encompasses all three of these age categories, right? And you can see even across all of these age categories, the top 10% is not hitting any of these time standards, right? Either for New York or across all of the US marathons for 2024. Top 10% is not hitting these. However, top 1% from New York City Marathon is, and they hit it by a huge margin. So, all of this to say that people can run these times, and they are running these times by like 20 plus minutes on a hard course in New York. In New York, they're doing this, right? So just that's not to discourage you, that's to give you some inspiration and say, I can do this, right? All right, let's press on. 35 to 39. Again, we have the men's and women's times lined up here. The difference on the women's side, 15 minutes faster to apply for New York versus Boston and Chicago. On the men's side, 5 minutes faster. So you can see as from those prior age categories, right? The spread here is getting larger. Now, what does this look like in the averages? This is only this center band here because it's only a 5-year span, right? 35 to 39. So on the women's side, top 10% not making it, not at all. But the top 1% definitely very much making it without any kind of trouble. 13 minutes difference on the women's side from the 10% average. I'm highlighting all of this because all of these are going to change as we go along, and you're going to see, and it becomes a pretty eye-opening. On the men's side, what does the men's side look like? The men's side is 6 minutes slower for the top 10% average. The men's side is, spoiler alert, the men's side is pretty boring because it's pretty similar across the age groups. The women's side is all over the place, up, down, and sideways. All right, now we're into the Masters. We're at 40 to 44, and what happens here? The women's New York City Marathon standard is 9 minutes faster, and on the men's side, it is 7 minutes faster. What does this look like for the averages? Here it is right there in the middle, as you can see. So we're getting closer, right? The top 10% across all United States marathons in 2024 ran 7 minutes over the New York City Marathon time. So we're getting closer. And on the men's side, it's 7 minutes. This is not a drastic change from the prior age group. What happens at ages 45 to 49? New York City Marathon time is 7 minutes faster than Boston and Chicago, and the men's side, it is 10 minutes faster. And for the averages, here's the women's side. Whoa, it's a little bit different already. 1 minute difference. The top 10% across all US marathons in 2024, top 10% in the women's age category, 45 to 49, ran 1 minute over the New York City Marathon time. What does that tell you? That tells you that a pretty good chunk of people are running this time. And on the men's side, 6 minutes. 6 minutes slower on the men's side. All right, let's look at 50 to 54. We have something changing here. New York City Marathon time on the women's side becomes slightly slower than the Boston-Chicago times by 1 minute. Small difference, but it is a trend that is going to carry over. What happens on the men's side? Oh, -6 minutes on the men's side. Not anything surprising there. All right, let's look at the averages. Here we are for the women's 50 to 54. What a change. The top 10% in New York that ran New York City Marathon in 2024, the top 10% that ran any U.S. marathon with a field greater than 2,000 people, they all ran under the New York City Marathon standard in the women's category, 50 to 54. A lot of people have this time in the world. A lot of people have met this standard. Does that mean they're all applying? I do not know. I don't have a crystal ball or a seeing eye, so I have no idea. But the potential is there for a large cut in this category, again, because this standard is pretty well attained. On the men's side, 4 minutes over for the average. Here we are now, women and men, 50 to 55 to 59. And the New York City Marathon standard on the women's side has continued to be on the slower side, but the difference has changed. It is now 10 minutes over Boston and Chicago. The men's side remains New York City Marathon is 7 minutes faster. And what do we have here going on for the averages? It's, I'm sorry, but it's just like, what? Okay, so top 10% New York, top 10% across US marathons. They have met the standard for New York City Marathon by a good amount. Okay, again, a lot of people have this standard. A lot of people have met the New York City Marathon standard. Whether they apply, I cannot say, but the potential is out there. The men's side, what do we have on the men's side? The 10% average is 3 minutes over New York City Marathon standard. That is bad. That is a little bit of bad math there. We're rounding here, but I just caught that mistake. Okay, let's move on. Ages 60 to 64. What happens here? Again, New York City Marathon time is becoming slower compared to the Boston time. And something changes for both the men's and the women's side, which is that the Chicago time becomes faster. This is recent. Chicago changed their qualifying times very recently, about 2 years ago. Boston has changed their qualifying times over and over, but it changed most recently for 2025 this year to apply for the 2026 race. Totally new time standards for every age group except the age group 60 and above. So this is why you are seeing this. And these are literally the first years that this is occurring. And what do we have here happening with the averages? On the women's side, it's drastic, right? We're talking about 20-something minutes under the New York City Marathon standard for the top 10% averages. And again, they're under the Boston standards, they're under the Chicago standards. So just keep this in the back of your mind if you're in this age group. One thing I will note, I just want to stop and say one thing. I do not have the chart in this, but for marathoning across the board, in terms of age group distribution between men and women, there's a drop off, right? It's the younger age groups have far more participants, oftentimes actually by double digits, right? Versus the older age group. So it's a nice curve down, right? So there are fewer participants in these age categories marathoning at all, period. And so in some senses, yes, while a lot of people may be reaching these standards, that does not necessarily equate to a lot of people, right? Because the available pool in this age category, especially for women, is on the smaller side. So that was a little bit convoluted and maybe a little bit complicated, but hopefully you understand what I'm saying. All right, on the men's side holds pretty steady. Again, I said it holds pretty steady across the board. 5 minutes slower on the average versus New York City Marathon standard. All right, 65 to 69. Again, New York City Marathon time slower. It's now the slowest between Boston and Chicago on the women's side. And the Chicago time for both men and women has become faster than the Boston time. Now we'll look at the averages. Here's the women's side. Like, I don't think we're surprised by this by now, right? The trend is holding steady and the numbers are growing, right? So we're almost we are over 30 minutes difference now between the New York City Marathon standard versus the top 10% at New York and all across all US races. So this is it's a pretty chunky buffer there, right? And on the men's side, 6 minutes, holding steady on the men's side. Let's look at women and men 70 to 74. New York City Marathon times even slower. Even slower than Boston and Chicago by quite a bit now. And Chicago time is still faster than Boston for these age categories. I explained why that is, but this is the reason. Boston held steady on their standards for all the age groups 60 and older. No change to them. Everybody else got a trim of 5 minutes. What does this look like for the averages? I don't have the New York City Marathon data, but for the US races across the board in 2024, a huge difference, nearly an hour between New York City Marathon standard and the average for American runners in this age group. You could expect a lot, like a pretty steep cut if you were applying in this age group. But it depends on how many applicants they receive, right? If there's only 3 people applying and they have 3 spots, everybody gets in, even if you have a 1 second buffer, right? We don't know. So it could go either way, but as I'm pointing out, the potential is there for something really huge, like an hour, an hour difference, right? And the men's side, 1 minute, 1 minute over for the average. So this is as close as it ever gets on the men's side. So again, potentially on both sides of this equation, men and women, there could be a pretty decent sized cut for New York City Marathon qualifying. 75 to 79, may we all live this long and still be running. That's my goal in life. The women's time for New York City Marathon remains up over Boston and Chicago. And something unique happens on the men's side here, which is that New York City Marathon now matches the Chicago time. Instead of being the fastest of all 3, it now matches Chicago. And it's only 5 minute difference between Boston and Chicago. I don't have the averages for these, so I can't compare. But we will look at the 80 plus time qualifying standards. And again, I just want to say, if you are running marathons and you are in this age group of either gender, man, kudos to you, because you are awesome in my book. I hope we all get to run till 80, right? New York City Marathon Standard remains over the other two. And now for the very first time, really the only time, on the men's side, the New York City Marathon Standard is over Boston and Chicago. So that is all of them. We've gone through all of them. We've picked them apart. I've pointed out a couple of averages. Hopefully you learned some things. Hopefully, like take a screenshot of some of these for your age category or the one you're moving up to next. Give yourself some targets to aim for. And I'll see you out on the roads. Happy training and happy running.